Could you run the slide for me? Just press the button, sweetheart. The words echoed through the strategic briefing room, gentle in tone, yet ruthless in impact. A few soft chuckles followed, just enough to make it clear that she was not considered an equal in this room. Rachel Monroe did not respond. She stood up, walked forward, and did exactly what was asked of her. No reaction. No explanation. Not a single sign that she expected respect. The man continued, speaking, his voice confident, smooth, as if carefully rehearsed. He boasted about the algorithm, the predictive model, the 94% figure delivered like a predetermined verdict. In his view, the data was already clear. The machines had calculated in place of human judgment. No further opinions were needed. No further questions required. Rachel looked up at the screen. She did not nod. She did not take notes. She simply looked. And as he continued to dominate the room, her silence began to feel different. Not the silence of someone being overpowered, but the silence of someone who had just realized something was wrong. He turned toward her and smiled the smile of a man convinced he was in control. He said this was why he was paid. That machines were not emotional. That this room had no need for secondary opinions. The room grew quiet. Not because they believed him, but because someone had just been stripped of human worth with a single sentence. Rachel returned to her seat. Her hand rested on the table, perfectly still, not trembling, not clenched, just still. In that moment, the conflict took shape. On one side stood authority built on titles and volume. On the other stood competence forged in silence, competence that had once saved Livazu, though no one in this room recognized it yet. And from that instant on, Rachel's silence began to carry the weight of something every person there would eventually be forced to confront. If you believe there are women who have carried responsibility in silence, subscribe to veterans' legacy stories, to listen to legacies that were never properly named. Rachel Monroe did not look at Evan Cole again. Her gaze settled on the numbers flowing across the display streams of data that seemed lifeless to others, but to her they had always spoken their own language. She did not need to appear attentive because her attention had never been on the person speaking. It was fixed on what was not being said. Rachel's hand rested on the surface of the table, then paused for a fraction longer than normal. No one in the room noticed the small gesture, but to someone shaped by the discipline of the United States Marine Corps, such a pause was never accidental. It was the moment when instinct spoke before reason, when experience stepped ahead of every algorithm. She studied the data Evan had called very clear. She looked into the gaps between the numbers, into the silences the system was treating as routine. Rachel did not frown. She did not tilt her head. She simply looked. And in that looking, she recognized something was wrong. Not a glaring error, but a subtle absence, a familiar sign of compromised data distorted just enough to deceive anyone, focused only on the final output. She did not speak immediately, not out of fear, not out of hesitation, but out of discipline. The discipline of a non-commissioned officer forged over years in environments where speaking at the wrong moment could cost an entire unit its life. Rachel had learned that silence was sometimes the only way to maintain control of a situation. Her first instinct was not to challenge, but to verify, to confirm that what she was sensing was real. Evan continued talking. His voice flowed steadily, growing more confident with every sentence. Rachel's silence was interpreted in the way most comforting to his ego. He assumed she had accepted her lower place, that she understood her role in this room, that she was merely background, insufficiently important to interrupt the momentum of his presentation. The algorithm doesn't make mistakes, he said almost as a conclusion. It removes human emotion. Rachel heard the words without any change in expression. She had heard similar claims before in other places under different circumstances. In those places, people also believed machines were smart enough to replace human judgment until a signal was missed. A decision delayed by a second, and the consequences were measured in lives. She had seen failures born from blind confidence in systems. She remained silent, not because she had nothing to say, but because she knew exactly what she held in her hands. That silence did not make her smaller in the room. If anything, it made the surrounding noise feel misplaced. The more Evan spoke, the wider the gap became between his words and the reality Rachel was seeing. A few people began nodding along with Evan, not because they understood, but because they trusted the authority standing before them. Rachel saw it clearly. She had seen it many times before. Young professionals, sharp minds, but ones who had never been accountable when things collapsed. They learned to trust rank before they trusted data. Rachel drew in a quiet breath, then released it slowly. No one heard it. But inside her, the confirmation was complete. The data was compromised. Not possibly, certainly. And when she chose to speak, it would not be an opinion. It would be a fact. Evan, unaware of this, continued forward with the confidence of someone who believed he was winning. He did not realize that with every second Rachel remained silent, control was slipping further from his grasp. Not loudly, not abruptly, but quietly and inevitably, like the way seasoned soldiers wait for the exact moment to act. That silence was not weakness. It was restraint. It was discipline. It was the mark of someone accustomed to speaking only when their words could change the outcome. And in that room, there was only one person who truly understood that. And when Rachel finally chose to break that silence, Evan Cole would realize that his confidence had just stepped into territory he did not understand at all. Rachel Monroe finally spoke. She did not raise her voice. She did not cut anyone off rudely. It was just a single sentence enough to slip into a presentation that had drifted too far from the truth. She said there was a data point being misinterpreted, that the signal from an intermediary station was not entirely reliable, that the probability generated by the system could not be treated as a conclusion. Her voice was calm, free of personal emotion. It was neither a challenge nor a debate-driven rebuttal. It was like someone pointing out an error on a map before the entire group went astray. But Evan Cole did not listen to the full sentence. Sorry, he cut in his voice, sharp and cold. And who exactly are you? The question was not meant to seek an answer. It was thrown like a blade sharp enough to sever the fragile ground Rachel had just stepped onto. Evan looked her up and down, then smiled. A familiar smile of smug assurance worn by someone convinced he was standing above the rest. You're technical support, right? Your job is to make sure things run. A few laughs broke out around the table. Not loud, not crude, but clear enough for Rachel to hear. It was the kind of laughter that required no malice, only agreement. Agreement that someone should be placed back into her proper lower position within the room's invisible hierarchy. Rachel's expression did not change. She looked at Evan, then at those who had laughed. Her eyes held no anger. They carried the look of someone far too familiar with moments like this. Familiar with being dismissed before being heard. Familiar with having to prove her worth in rooms where authority always arrived before competence. So let me ask you. Evan continued, his voice rising slightly. What rank do you hold? What authority do you have to interrupt a high-level briefing like this? He delivered the questions like a sentence. Rank, authority. Two words used to define human value in this room. Not what she saw in the data. Not what she had lived through. Only what could be printed on a badge. Rachel did not answer right away. Not because she did not know how, but because she understood exactly what was happening. This exchange was no longer about data. It had become a test of power. And Evan was trying to drag her out of her professional ground, forcing her to justify her very presence. Evan glanced down at the table, his eyes stopping on a small object beside Rachel's laptop. A dark, worn metal coin. He picked it up between two fingers and turned it slightly. What's this? A lucky charm. A few people looked over. Someone raised an eyebrow. Someone smiled. Evan chuckled softly, as if he had just found proof that he was right. You bring personal items into a strategic briefing. Interesting. Rachel looked at the coin in his hand. For the first time, her eyes changed. Not with anger, but because a memory had just been touched. That coin was not decoration. It was not a harmless keepsake. It had been placed into her hand by someone who had once stood at the edge between life and death. A mark of recognition that required no explanation. But Evan did not know that. And in his mind, he did not need to. We're talking about national security, he went on, not personal souvenirs. The room fell silent. No one laughed anymore. No one spoke in her defense. This silence was different from before. Heavier. Not because of the data, but because a line had just been crossed. A single sentence had turned condescension into insult, from professional dismissal to an attack on honor. Rachel lifted her head. Her eyes no longer rested on the screen. They settled on Evan. Calm, clear, unflinching. She did not reach for the coin. She did not demand an explanation. She simply looked at him. And in that moment, Evan failed to realize that he had just touched something he did not understand at all. He believed he was still in control. But in truth, he had dragged this confrontation into a different territory, one where real rank, real memory, and real honor were about to surface. And when that happened, this room would no longer be a place where Evan Cole could hide his ignorance behind laughter. Evan Cole let his smile fade. His initial confidence hardened into rigid decisiveness, the kind that appears when a person believes power is still firmly in their hands. He lifted his head, his voice clearer now, no longer masking his intent. "I don't think you should remain in this room," Evan said. "Your presence is disrupting the meeting." No one responded immediately. The statement was not a suggestion. It was an order wrapped in polite language. Evan glanced around, waiting for the familiar confirmation, waiting for someone to nod and reinforce his decision. "This is a high-level briefing," he continued. "We can't allow unverified assessments to interfere with the decision-making process." Rachel Monroe remained seated. She did not stand. She did not protest. She did not ask permission to stay. She simply sat there, back straight, eyes calm. Her composure made Evan's words sound more isolated than he had anticipated. Near the door, the security personnel exchanged glances. They did not move. Not out of hesitation, but because they had learned an unwritten rule in rooms like this: an order only carries weight when it is confirmed by the right authority. And Evan Cole was not that authority. While Evan waited for a response, someone else had remained silent from the very beginning: Admiral Jonathan Hale. He did not shift his posture. He showed no irritation. He did not interrupt. But his eyes had never left Rachel since the moment she first spoke. It was not the gaze of scrutiny. It was the gaze of someone listening not only to what was being said, but to what lay hidden beneath it. Beside him, his aide lowered her head, further fingers moving quickly across a personal device. No one in the room noticed the action, but with every passing second, layers of information were being opened. Rachel's name, an old record, flagged entries, details that would never appear on any civilian nameplate. Evan, unaware of this, took another step forward. "I'm asking security to escort her out," he said, his voice not loud but unmistakably clear. "We need to focus on the core agenda." The security personnel did not move. This silence was different from before. It was no longer neutral. It carried a new weight, as if the room itself were waiting for something that had not yet arrived. Rachel looked at Evan. Her gaze held no challenge. It was the look of someone accustomed to being placed in situations like this. She had faced decisions far more difficult, where being removed from a room was not the worst possible outcome. What concerned her was not her position, but what would happen if the truth continued to be ignored. Admiral Hale tilted his head slightly. He said nothing, but the gesture was enough for his aide to understand that the verification needed to be accelerated. The text on the record became clearer. Years of service. Units once attached. Missions never mentioned in public reports. Power in the room began to shift. Not loudly, not suddenly. It did not overturn the existing order at once. But it started to move away from where Evan stood, grain by grain, like sand slipping from the grip of someone holding too tightly. Evan sensed the change, even though he could not name it. He spoke a few more words, as if to reassure himself that he still controlled the situation. But with each sentence, the room responded less. No more reflexive nods. No more looks of automatic agreement. Rachel remained silent. But her silence was no longer mistaken for weakness. It resembled the patience of someone who knows there is no need to rush what cannot be avoided. She did not look toward the door. She did not look toward security. She simply sat there, as if time itself were on her side. And in that moment, though no one had yet stood, though no declaration had been made, one thing became clear. This confrontation was no longer under Evan Cole's control. The truth was coming. Not quickly. Not gently. And once it arrived, no one in that room would be able to pretend they had never heard it. And just as Evan still believed he had issued a final command, the only person with true authority in the room was ready to stand. No one gave an order. No one signaled. But the moment Admiral Jonathan Hale stood up, the room changed instantly. Not because of sound, but because of instinct. Those in uniform straightened almost simultaneously. No one told them to. It was discipline forged over years of service, where the body responds before the mind has time to intervene. Evan Cole remained standing where he was. He did not understand what had just happened. He only saw the most powerful man in the room rise from his chair. An instinct told him that this was no longer a moment that could be controlled with words. Admiral Hale did not look at Evan. He did not give him even a glance. The disregard was not an insult. It was simply removal. In the military world, that is the clearest way to signal who no longer stands at the center of the story. He walked to Rachel Monroe's side. Not in front of her, not above her, just beside her. Close enough to affirm, formal enough to require no explanation. Rachel looked up. Her expression was not one of surprise, only a brief pause as if she had anticipated this moment, even though she had never expected it. Admiral Hale raised his hand in salute. The motion was sharp, precise, without a fraction, wasted. The room fell into complete silence. No one breathed heavily. No one moved. Those present understood they were witnessing a moment that could not be taken back. Gunnery Sergeant Rachel Monroe. He said it in a low, steady voice. Not as a question, not as an introduction. It was a confirmation. A rank spoken correctly at the right moment before the people who needed to hear it. Rachel stood. She could not return the salute in kind, but her posture spoke for her. Back straight, shoulders level, eyes calm. This was not the stance of someone being rescued. It was the stance of someone whose true value had finally been recognized. A few people in the room began to understand. The scattered pieces suddenly fell into place. Rachel's composure, the way she read the data, the way she remained silent when dismissed. That had not been the patience of someone weak. It was the self-command of someone accustomed to far greater pressure. Evan Cole swallowed hard. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then stopped. Not because he was interrupted, but because he realized that any words now would be meaningless. The rank that had just been spoken was not merely a title. It was a reminder that this room contained someone who had carried responsibilities he had never faced. Admiral Hale lowered his hand. He turned back, his eyes sweeping the room. He did not raise his voice. He did not reprimand anyone. By presence alone, he restored order, and order not built on civilian titles or lucrative contracts, but on service and proven competence. Rachel looked straight ahead. She did not search for anyone's gaze. She did not wait for an apology. This moment was not about revenge. It was about returning everything to its proper place. And once that happened, she had nothing more to do. In those brief seconds, power in the room had fully reversed. Not loudly, not through argument. Just a name spoken the right way, and every assumption that had come before collapsed with it. And immediately after that confirmation, the truth of who Rachel Monroe really was began to be spoken not through emotion, but through facts that could not be denied. Admiral Jonathan Hale did not raise his voice. He spoke only loud enough for everyone to hear clearly, and that restraint gave every word an undeniable weight. He read Rachel Monroe's file like an administrative memorandum, yet each line fell into the room with the gravity of history. United States Marine Corps, he said. Signals intelligence? No one laughed. No one shifted. Those who had called Rachel technical support began to understand that they had judged a human being by the most convenient surface impression. The Admiral continued his tone unchanged. She served as a signals analyst on special joint operations. Her job was not to run slides. Her job was to hear what the enemy believed no one could hear. Someone in the room drew a quiet breath, not out of emotion, but from realizing that what was being said was not meant to impress. It was simply the truth. During an operation in a high-risk area, the Admiral went on, Gunnery Sergeant Monroe detected an anomalous signal the system did not flag. That information led to the discovery of an ambush. A SEAL unit withdrew safely. There was no ornate language, no dramatic description. And yet it was enough. Everyone in the room understood exactly what withdrew safely meant in that context. It was not a line in a performance report. It was lives that remained after the mission ended. The Admiral paused for a moment, then looked toward the coin on the table. And this, he said, is not a lucky charm. He explained briefly, as if correcting a small but dangerous misunderstanding. This is a command coin. It is not given for presence. It is given for action. For decisions made in silence with consequences measured in lives. Rachel listened without lowering her head, without looking at anyone else. She had lived with those truths for too long to need validation. But hearing them spoken here, in front of those who had doubted her, carried a different meaning. Not for her, but for the room. The Admiral turned to Rachel. You said the data was wrong, he said. Show us. Rachel nodded. Just a slight nod. She stood without haste. When she began to speak, her voice was unchanged from before, still calm, still precise, free of any trace of retaliation. The algorithm isn't wrong, she said. It's being fed incomplete data. She pointed out the signal loss. She explained why the gap was not ordinary interference. She described the signal degradation the system had ignored because it appeared familiar. The terminology was not used to display expertise, but to clarify one simple truth: the real threat was not where everyone was looking. "This is a diversion," Rachel said. "They want us looking this way," while preparing to move in another direction. She paused, then added one final sentence. "If we don't adjust, the consequences won't stop at a false warning." No one asked another question. No one challenged her. Not because there were no questions left, but because every question had become unnecessary. The data stood on its own. It required no debate, no raised voices. It proved its value by existing. Evan Cole looked down at the table. He no longer tried to interject. Not out of fear, but because for the first time he understood that he was standing before someone whose authority did not come from a current position, but from what she had carried before. The room sank into absolute silence. Not an awkward silence, but the silence of recognition. Truth does not need to be shouted. When it is placed correctly, it stands on its own. And from that silence, a lesson began to form, not about data, but about how people confront honor and their own mistakes. The decision was made swiftly, without the need for further debate. Admiral Jonathan Hale spoke clearly, each word free of anger, yet firm enough to close the door on all doubt. Evan Cole's contract was suspended. His authorization to participate in strategic briefings ended right there. There was no lengthy explanation, no opportunity to argue. Evan stood still for several seconds, as if he had not yet grasped what had just happened. Then he lowered his head, not because he was forced to, but because he realized he had been standing in the wrong place from the beginning. His face flushed not with anger, but with shame. Shame at remembering every careless line he had spoken. Shame at understanding that the woman before him had remained silent longer than necessary solely to protect a standard he had never learned to respect. "I was wrong," Evan said, his voice low and dry. "I didn't know." No one responded immediately. The room did not need further punishment. Everything that needed to be said had already been said through action, and in that moment it was Rachel Monroe who broke the silence. "You didn't know," she said calmly. "Now you do. That's enough." The words carried no easy forgiveness, nor were they mercy handed down from a higher place. They were the words of a soldier to someone who had learned a lesson too late. No bitterness, no humiliation piled on top of what had already occurred. Evan lifted his head and looked at Rachel. There was no resistance left in his eyes, only the clear realization that what he had just lost was not merely a position, but an illusion about himself. He nodded very slightly as a sign of acceptance. Rachel turned to the others in the room. She did not seek their approval. She spoke because she knew the lesson was not meant for Evan alone. "The standard doesn't care who you are," she said. "It doesn't care what you wear or how much you're paid. It only cares whether you do the job right." She paused for a moment. "And that standard only matters when it's applied fairly." The words settled into the room like a principle that had existed for a long time, one that had simply been forgotten amid the noise of power and ego. A few people lowered their heads, not to apologize to Rachel, but to examine themselves. The younger ones understood they had just witnessed a different kind of leadership, one not rooted in punishment, but in responsibility and education. Admiral Hale said nothing more. He did not need to reinforce what had just been spoken. He understood that the heaviest lessons always come from those who have lived them, and Rachel Monroe was exactly that. She was not here to reclaim honor for herself. She was here to ensure that honor was not used as a tool to crush others. Evan stepped back once. No one stopped him. No one urged him on. He understood that he had received enough. And more importantly, he had learned something he should have known before he ever walked into this room. Rachel sat down. There was no applause, no praise. The silence that followed was not heavy. It was calm and clean, like the stillness after rain, when everything unnecessary has been washed away. Honor in this room had crushed no one. It had done exactly what it was meant to do. It taught. And when a lesson is delivered the right way, no further explanation is required. And from that educational silence, quiet changes began to take shape, not in words, but in how people would treat the next person who walked into this room. Change did not arrive with applause. It arrived through decisions. Rachel Monroe was appointed to lead the analysis division, not because of the moment her name was spoken correctly, but because of the years before that, when she had done the right work in silence. The strategic room returned to its familiar rhythm, but the order within it had changed. There was no longer a rush to trust numbers simply because they were presented well. No longer a false sense of security in letting algorithms speak in place of people. A new protocol was issued. Every line of data had to be verified by human judgment before the system could reach a conclusion. Not because machines were incapable, but because artificial intelligence carries no memory, bears no responsibility, and does not live with consequences. The protocol did not carry Rachel's name, but everyone knew why it existed. Rachel continued working as she always had. She did not speak more than necessary. She did not seek recognition. The younger analysts began learning to listen before they spoke. They looked at Rachel not with curiosity, but with trust. She did not recount her achievements. She asked the right questions at the right moments. And when she spoke, she said only enough to remind everyone that standards are not meant to be compromised. Sometime later, on an ordinary afternoon, Evan Cole appeared. The old confidence was gone. The familiar commanding tone had vanished. He stood before Rachel, awkward hands clasped together like someone who had lost his direction. No one had forced him to come. He came because he needed to say something he had never imagined he would need to say. "I'm sorry," Evan said. "Not because I lost my job, but because I failed to see the human being in front of me." Rachel listened. She did not nod right away. She did not interrupt. When he finished, she looked him directly in the eyes, without reproach, without avoidance. The silence lingered just long enough for the apology to have its place. "Listen to your senior veterans," Rachel said. It was not personal advice. It was a principle. Evan nodded. He understood that the advice was not meant for him alone, but for anyone who enters rooms where power makes it easy to forget the origins of standards. Rachel returned to her work. She did not watch Evan walk away. She did not need to know what he would do next. Legacy is not about controlling someone else's path. It is about planting the right truth at the right moment. In the meetings that followed, something small yet unmistakable had changed. When a new woman entered the room, no one asked which department she belonged to before listening. When differing opinions surfaced, no one rushed to dismiss them with a smile. Questions were asked with respect, not out of fear, but out of understanding. They did not just remember Rachel Monroe's name. They remembered the moment the standard was reset. They remembered how one woman stood still when she was dismissed, spoke when it mattered, and stopped at the right moment so that honor would not become a tool for punishment. They didn't just remember her name. They remembered how they treated the next woman. Legacy is not a rank that makes others bow their heads. Legacy is how we teach those who come after us when to lift their heads. Rachel did not need to be remembered as a symbol. She left behind something far more important, a way of conduct, a principle, a standard that does not compromise. And as that room continued to function, data still analyzed, decisions still made, one thing would never return to what it had been: contempt. It had been replaced by listening. And that is how women who once carried responsibility in silence leave their mark. Veterans' legacy stories. We remember the quiet heroes. If this story makes you look at a woman with deeper respect, subscribe to Veterans' Legacy Stories so that women veterans are never forgotten.